The Omnipotent Self, a study in self-deception and self-cure by Paul Bousfield. Part 1, The Omnipotent Self. Chapter 8, The Irritable Temperament. Irritability is not merely that quality in a person which makes his friends carefully guard their every word, lest inadvertently they should cause an outburst of temper. In its fullest sense, it means over-sensitiveness to unpleasant stimuli, followed by overreaction of any kind whatsoever. Thus, if a person by accident damage his clothing, his oversensitiveness and overreaction might result in an oath, in abusing the nail which tore his clothing, or in abusing the workman who put the nail in place originally. It might again result in a feeling of depression with anger displaced on anyone who was present during the next hour on the smallest pretext. Or in an oversensitive woman, it might result in an outburst of tears, or perhaps merely in volubly deploring the accident for half an hour with the next visitor who called, or she might merely worry about it and keep turning the memory of it over and over in her mind, refusing to allow the fact to separate itself from her fancy. All these various results, with many others which may be imagined, can be gathered together under the one term, irritability, or the term oversensitiveness would do equally well. This irritability or oversensitiveness may apply to material things or to purely mental ones. Narcissism may lead to an irritability of the body, and again it may lead to irritability merely of the mind. When narcissism leads to an extremely sensitive body, it reacts to pain of every sort, however mild, as though it were acute. The omnipotent mind cannot bear to have its body disturbed. I gave an example a short while back of a lady who could not take a fly out of my eye, because her own eyes were so sensitive. Not only was this particular lady sensitive as regards her eyes, but at that period she was afraid of the dentist touching a tooth as if it had been a serious abdominal operation. Pain of any sort or even slight accidents involving practically no pain were reacted to as though they had been overwhelming misfortunes. Here we had an excellent example of one in whom narcissism had produced extreme irritability of a physical nature. On the other hand, one finds a mental sensitivity equally pronounced. People who are always in fear lest somebody should find fault with them, with their mode of behavior, with their manner of dress, even with their habit of thought. Unconsciously to themselves, they are the acme of perfection. They are the center of importance, and they are inclined to think that people are paying very much more attention to them than is actually the case. They may consciously realize that they are not important at all, that other people do not give them a thought, but their unconscious narcissism will not accept this slight upon their importance, and they remain miserably self-conscious in all their acts, reacting with exaggerated feeling whenever some slight criticism of their thoughts and actions appear even to be implied. Pride, vanity, and self-importance are other manifestations of this temperament. The person who feels slighted or whose feelings are hurt when other persons think too little of his opinions or pay too little attention to his actions, or in fact, whose feelings are hurt easily by anything whatsoever, is for the most part a narcissist, in whom once again the infantile omnipotence has been disturbed. Jealousy very often represents the narcissistic idea, the dog in the manger attitude, which, finding it cannot possess for itself, cannot bear anybody else to possess, is largely the attitude of unconscious fantasy, in which the individual cannot relinquish the idea that somehow he will succeed by means of his omnipotent mind in possessing the desired object. And his unconscious mind retains this idea so long as the object has not become the property of someone else in such a definite and irrefutable manner as to prove, in spite of his unconscious fantasy, that he cannot possibly possess it himself. The dog in the manger attitude is one which simply refuses to recognize the impossibility of possessing something, although the desire for possession in any particular case may unconsciously mean nothing except the desire to prove to oneself one's own omnipotence. And many a case of jealousy in love affairs is nothing but this unconscious desire to prove to oneself the possession of power. It is the hatred of acknowledging the fact that one has not control where one desires to have it most. Curious as it may seem, jealousy is bred mostly out of self-love rather than out of love for the other person. Although, of course, except in extreme cases, love for the other person may also exist. The reaction which takes place whenever the narcissistic element is hurt almost always takes the form of a regression. It will be remembered that a regression implies a return to an infantile method of expression. The narcissistic infallibly hopes in his unconscious that his omnipotence will enable him to avoid an unpleasant fact and to controvert it magically. He therefore falls back on those acts of infancy which he found useful at that early period of his life as magical means of attaining his ends. Let us assume, for example, that our narcissist has entered quietly into an argument with a friend, with full faith in himself and his argument that he will convert his friend to his own point of view. He finds, however, that he is getting the worst of the argument. This is unbelievable to him. He cannot realize it. His friend must be pig-headed. Rapidly, his unconscious mind says to himself, "What methods did I employ in my childhood? What magic formula did I use then to obtain what I wished?" "Ah," says the unconscious, "I remember I used abusive terms to my nurse, and the dear thing did what I wanted at once." Very soon he is using abusive terms to his friend, who, however, does not later on remark, "Oh, that man is a narcissist." He merely says, "You know, so-and-so never can keep his temper in an argument." And the poor narcissist all the time feels and thinks that he has been hardly dealt with, that people do not understand him, that they deliberately will not follow his arguments. Of course, the last is very likely to be right, for in argument there is generally more rationalization than there is about most things in life. Nevertheless, the fact remains that it is not really important that his friend should understand either him or his argument as a rule, and if he were not narcissistic, he would not overreact to this stimulus. Other methods of reaction in a like manner are all regressions to infancy. Some narcissists, when they ask their unconscious memory, "What magic did I employ as a child?" find that it was the magic of words, and they use explicitives of various kinds, which correspond in every way to the magic words which a conjurer whispers over his tricks when he performs the apparently impossible. Others remember in their unconscious mind that they wept copiously, that when they wept, the feeding bottle was returned to their lips, or the toy to their hands. Others go back a stage further. They withdraw into themselves, they refuse to speak, or they say, "I am so upset I must go and lie down." They attempt to return, in fact, to the condition of isolation and rest, if not of pre-birth, at least of that period immediately following birth when, if they cried, they were rocked and crooned over and put to sleep. Another form of regression, largely due to narcissism, is that of alcoholism. Here again, there are other causes at work in the unconscious, but narcissism is one of the most important of them. The narcissist does not like real responsibility. He certainly thinks that he is always desiring responsible posts and positions, but this is merely because to hold a responsible position or to have responsibility signifies importance and power. As a matter of fact, when responsibility is thrust upon him, he often has a strong tendency to avoid it, because responsibility entails dealing with facts as they are and not with fantasies. And the responsibility which the narcissist seeks is largely that of fantasy. In spite, therefore, of his statements to the contrary, we know that he wishes to run away from responsible positions, and alcohol has a peculiar power of enabling one to forget the responsibilities of the moment, and at the same time to give one a feeling of potency and well-being. Consequently, when the narcissist comes up against an unpleasant fact, a responsibility which he does not wish to take, anything in fact which disturbs his sense of well-being, alcohol serves the purpose of allowing regression to infancy. It returns him very swiftly to that early period when he had no responsibility, when he need take no thought of the facts around him, when he had a sense of well-being and omnipotence. This potency is increased by the fact that it also removes simultaneously other repressions, that is, it allows other forms of infantile energy to be expressed without conscious criticism or hindrance. Exactly the same thing may be said of drug taking. The drug taker is simply habitually seeking something to remove his responsibilities, to lead him away from his conflicts which he does not wish to face, away from the world of reality to an infantile world where whatever his surroundings, whatever the facts that exist, he is able to ignore them and feel himself in fantasy their master. But the curious thing about all these regressions is that, in a sense, they serve to satisfy the individual. They comfort him with the unconscious assurance at the moment they are performed that all will somehow be well, that these reactions will somehow bring about the desired end, that the abuse will succeed where the argument did not, that the tears will somehow perform their magic act, that a rest in bed will bring about new life, and that the new life will succeed where the old life failed. Never does the narcissist realize facts as they are, deal with them as facts, see them in their proper proportions, and leave them alone when he cannot use them. Impatience of a different kind is also one of the common reactions. A man may go into a restaurant. He finds it is full, and quite naturally he is kept waiting a few minutes before the busy waiter can bring him the menu. He refuses to recognize the fact that he is only one of 100 persons present, that the restaurant has to be run at a profit to the proprietor, that innumerable waiters cannot therefore be kept to serve his high omnipotence. He frets with impatience, and he cannot resign himself to the inevitable waiting. He will not understand that time is one of the factors over which he has no power. In fact, this difficulty to realize the factor of time is an extremely common one with narcissists. No sooner has a project entered their heads than they expect to see it fulfilled. Such fulfillment can only take place in fantasy, just as they did indeed attain their wishes in childhood. As children, they could instantaneously create a chariot and horses from an armchair with complete neglect of the time factor. And now, as adults, they hope instantaneously to create an omelet without waiting for it to be cooked, to create a business or a character or fame or happiness in the same instantaneous way without reference to time. They are quite unable to see completely and wholly any difference between the fantasy of childhood and facts of adult life. And one of the most essential differences between the two is this time factor. It takes minutes for an omelet to be cooked. It takes years for a business to be created. It takes a lifetime for a character to be formed. Fame they may never attain, but happiness lies within their grasp at once if only they could relinquish their narcissism. End of chapter 8.